Cards with X in their mana cost are fairly common. When a card has X in its mana cost, it means you can pump as much mana as you want to into X, and you get an effect where the effect gets stronger the more mana you spend. However, spells with XX in their mana cost are much less common. For this type of spell, you have to spend the same amount of mana on each X. Generally, they add a second or even a third X, because the spell would be way too strong if you only had to pay X a single time. Even when you have to pay X twice, though, these types of spells are often very strong. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have at least 2 X's in its mana cost. There were only 45 cards eligible, but of them, 26 have at least one top 8 at a major Magic event, and in this video we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Quarantine Field. For XX and 2 white, it's an enchantment and it enters with X isolation counters on it, and when it enters, you exile up to 1 target non-land permanent opponent controls for each isolation counter on it until it leaves the battlefield. Basically, it's an X spell, Oblivion Ring. Having a single card that can exile multiple non-land permanents is quite powerful. Even just the baseline form of Quarantine Field where you pay 1 for X is an okay card, and it scales from there. It saw play in standard decks like Selesnya Tokens and Orzhov Control, and it also saw a bit of play in the early days of the Pioneer format, appearing in Devotion to White decks, which were quite adept at producing tons of mana thanks to Nykthos, and having a removal spell that stayed on the board and adds to your devotion was itself a pretty nice thing for devotion decks. However, Quarantine Field doesn't have any top 8 since 2020, and it's probably not going to be on this list for very long. At number 9, it's Conflagrate. For XX and a red, it does X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures or players. It also has flashback for 2 red and you discard X cards. Being able to divide damage is pretty sweet, as you can use it to wipe out your opponent's entire board if you have enough mana for X. Despite being printed way back in 2006, Conflagrate didn't top 8 its first major event until 2011. Finding a way to really abuse it was kind of challenging, since it costs a ton of mana to cast from your hand, and it needs a ton of cards to make casting it from your graveyard worthwhile. Its top 8s have all come in Modern, first finding success in Ad Nauseam decks, which look to draw a ton of cards and can use Conflagrate as a win condition from the graveyard. It's found even more success, though, in Dredge decks, which specialize in rapidly loading up the graveyard. In that deck, it isn't used as a win condition so much as an early game tempo play that lets you discard a bunch of cards you want in your graveyard anyway, while also wiping out the opponent's board. Conflagrate doesn't see an enormous amount of play in Modern, but it does see consistent play, so it has a good shot at maintaining a spot on this list going forward. At number 8, it's Doppelgang. For 3X, a green and a blue, it's a sorcery that makes X token copies of up to X target permanents. So if you pay 1 for X, you get 1 copy of 1 permanent. It's basically a clone. But once you're paying 2, things start to get really silly because you make 2 copies of each of 2 target permanents. In other words, you get 4 total permanents, and they are likely copies of the 2 best permanents on the battlefield. That kind of play is utterly backbreaking, and the baseline is a decent card too, making this a very powerful card overall. Most of Doppelgang's points have come in Standard. As you'd expect, it's been played in decks that are great at producing mana, like in Temur decks that use Aftermath Analyst to bring lots of lands back from the graveyard. It's also seeing a bit of play in Pioneer Aftermath Analyst decks. More recently, it's been played in the Standard Domain Overlord deck, which runs several Duskmourn Overlords, including Overlord of the Hauntwoods, which ramps your mana in a big way. The Overlords are all great targets for Doppelgang too, since they all have enters triggers. It's pretty difficult to beat even 1 copy of Overlord of the Mistmoors, for example. Doppelgang is going to continue to put up top 8s in Standard going forward. At number 7, it's Decree of Justice. For XX, 2 generic and 2 white, it's a sorcery that creates X 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying. So if you have a ton of mana, this can single-handedly build an angel army. You can also cycle it for 2 generic and a white, and if you do, you can pay X generic and create X 1/1 soldier tokens. That mode is pretty strong too. The creatures may not be quite as imposing, but you can make a heck of a lot more of them while also drawing a card. Also, when it gets cycled, it can't be stopped by traditional counterspells since, well, you're not casting a spell. It was heavily played in Standard, especially alongside Mirari's Wake, which was insane with the Decree. This is because it not only doubles your mana, it buffs all of your creatures, and the Decree is a mana-hungry card that lets you go super wide. It was also featured as a win condition in blue-white control. In Extended, it was played in Tron decks, which could use the Urza's lands to make lots of tokens, and in Legacy, it was played in Standstill decks. These decks look to stick that powerful enchantment which pops anytime a player casts a spell and lets the opposing player draw 3 cards. The Decree is great there because the cycling mode doesn't cast a spell, but you can pressure your opponent with a bunch of tokens that they have to do something about, which means you're going to get to draw 3 cards. However, Decree of Justice doesn't have any top 8s anywhere since 2017, and even though it recently became legal in Modern for the first time thanks to Modern Horizons 3, so far it hasn't done anything there. At number 6, it's Release the Gremlins. For XX and a red, it's a sorcery that destroys X target artifacts, and you create X 2/2 red gremlin creature tokens. Sure, it's a little bit narrow, but the power here is pretty legit. Even if you only destroy 1 artifact with this, you're spending 3 mana for a 2/2 that effectively removes an opponent's card. That's a pretty solid 2-for-1, and if you have more targets and more mana, casting Release the Gremlins against an artifact deck is usually just game over. Release the Gremlins points almost all came in Standard, where it saw a lot of sideboard play. After all, it's from Aether Revolt, and that entire block was artifact themed, and being able to destroy artifacts was pretty crucial in the format, so virtually every red deck was sideboarding Release the Gremlins. Even aggro decks were happy with it, because it meant they could simultaneously add to the board and destroy problem artifacts. Basically, they could add interaction for a specific permanent type that's usually kind of hard to destroy, while still being able to put a bunch of creatures on the battlefield. However, Release the Gremlins has only picked up 1 point since rotating out of Standard. It certainly has a bit of sideboard potential in Pioneer, but so far hasn't done much in the format. At number 5, it's Bonfire of the Damned. For XX and a red, the Bonfire does X damage to target player and each creature they control. That's already an incredibly powerful effect that can often amount to being a one-sided wrath stapled to a fireball, but that's even more true because the Bonfire also has Miracle. That means if it's the first card you draw in a turn, you can reveal it to your opponent, and if you do, you pay an alternate cost. In this case, you only pay X once, making it far more efficient. It was simply one of the most powerful cards in both Block and Standard, and it has also found more sporadic success in both Legacy and Modern, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2023. At number 4, it's Entreat the Angels, the second double X spell on the list that makes 4/4 Flying Angels. This one costs XX and 3 white and makes X of those tokens, but like Decree of Justice does, it has a way around paying so much mana. Entreat the Angels has Miracle, just like Bonfire of the Damned, and if you Miracle it, you pay X and 2 white, which is an excellent deal. Obviously, for this to be really powerful, you want to be able to cast it for that Miracle cost, which can allow you to cast it at instant speed too, should you draw your first card during your opponent's turn. And that often means you can untap and win the game. While it has seen sporadic play in Block, Standard, and Modern, Legacy is by far the format where it's done the most work. That format has lots of cards that let you manipulate your library. This was particularly true when Sensei's Divining Top was legal in the format. These days it's banned, partly because of how good it was at setting up miracles, but Entreat the Angels still sees play in control decks in the format, including in miracle-centric decks. Brainstorm, Ponder, and Sylvan Library are all still around, and they can help you stack the top of your deck to allow you to draw Entreat at the exact right time. Entreat the Angels is going to keep on gaining points in Legacy and will remain on this list for the foreseeable future. Now that I've told you about Entreat the Angels, let me entreat you to subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to reach 100,000 subscribers this year, and you can help me get there by hitting the subscribe button. At number 3, it's Hangarback Walker, which has more than 100 points more than Entreat the Angels, and really the top 3 cards on this list are kind of in their own tier that the other cards on it really can't approach. Anyway, Hangarback Walker for XX is a 0/0 artifact creature that enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. When it dies, you put a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token with flying into play for each +1/+1 counter on the Walker, and you can pay 1 generic and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Hangarback Walker is just an inherently powerful card. This is because no matter when you cast it, you get a body up front and at least 1 Thopter when it dies. And adding more counters to the Walker is very easy, and of course, if you pump a bunch of mana into X, your opponent is really going to be in trouble. This is very rarely a card where your opponent looks at it and goes, oh, that's no problem at all. As a result of all that power, it's seen play in every single format it's ever been legal in. In Standard, it was ubiquitous because any deck could run it. It appeared in decks as widely disparate from one another as Selesnya Aggro and Jeskai Control. However, in all formats, it's largely been played in artifact decks. In Standard, it was played in the artifact-centric Insol Artifact deck, which could get some extra mileage out of the Walker's typing. Putting Insol Artifact on the Walker was pretty sweet, as was putting it on a Thopter that was left behind. It's also been played in Pioneer Insol Artifact decks. In Modern, it's appeared in artifact decks like Affinity, but it's really thrived in the more recently developed Hardened Scales deck. This is still an artifact deck, but one that is particularly focused on +1/+1 counters, and especially the shenanigans you can pull off with Arcbound Ravager with Hardened Scales in play. You can sacrifice the Walker and get a bunch of Thopters to grow the Ravager to insane heights, and you can also use the Ravager's modular to put a bunch of tokens on the Walker so it makes more Thopters when it dies. It's also seen sporadic play in Legacy Hardened Scales and traditional Affinity decks, and in Vintage it shows up in Mishra's Workshop decks. The shop plus Tolarian Academy allows you to produce insane mana in the early game in artifact decks, and that allows you to cast the Walker as a huge creature even in the extreme early game, especially once you factor in the Power 9. Hangarback Walker is going to continue to put up top 8s in multiple formats going forward, but so are the two cards in front of it. I think number 3 is probably the best Hangarback Walker can ever do. At number 2, it's Walking Ballista, which like Hangarback Walker is an artifact creature that costs XX, is a 0/0, and enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. You can also add a +1/+1 counter to the Ballista for 4 generic mana, and you can remove a +1/+1 counter for it to do 1 damage to any target. So while the Ballista may not make a bunch of bodies if it dies, it does have a ping ability that doesn't cost any mana, making it an inherently powerful card too, and it has more combo potential than Hangarback Walker, because if you can find a way to either produce infinite mana or create a loop that puts counters on the Ballista, you can find a way to do lethal damage with it. However, in Standard, it wasn't really possible to go wild with a combo, but it still saw lots of play and was perhaps the most successful in Golgari Constrictor decks, a +1/+1 counter-centric deck that could really take advantage of the Ballista's love of counters with cards like Winding Constrictor. In Pioneer, the Ballista formed a nasty combo alongside Heliod the Sun-Crowned. Heliod gives you a +1/+1 counter anytime you gain life, and it can also give lifelink to the Ballista. If you do that, you can remove a counter to ping something, which because of lifelink gives you back a +1/+1 counter, and you do that as many times as you want to. The combo was so good that the Ballista ultimately got banned out of the format in 2020. However, Heliod and the Ballista are still friends in Modern where the combo is still intact, but that isn't even close to the only combo deck that the Ballista appears in the format. It also shows up in Brood Scale Bloodchief decks, which look to put the Blade of the Bloodchief on Basking Brood Scale, and then put a +1/+1 counter on it with Adapt. That makes a 0/1 creature that you can sacrifice, which puts a +1/+1 counter on the Brood Scale, which makes another 0/1. This ultimately creates infinite colorless mana, which you can use to machine gun your opponent to death with the Ballista. It's also used in Modern Agatha's Soul Cauldron decks, which can allow you to give any of your creatures the Ballista's ability. This is particularly potent with Undying creatures because removing their +1/+1 counters means that they can just keep on coming back when they die, so if you combine it with a sacrifice outlet, you can just kill your opponent with something like Geralf's Messenger. Those aren't even all of the Ballista's combos in Modern, but I'll stop there because I think at this point, you get that it's an insane combo card in the format. And on top of all of that, it's also played in Hardened Scales deck in Modern alongside Hangarback Walker, and Modern isn't even the last format we have to talk about. It's also played in Legacy Soul Cauldron, as well as the artifact-centric Mystic Forge and the colorless-focused Cloudpost decks, and in Vintage, it's of course played in Mishra's Workshop decks. Walking Ballista is going to continue to put up top 8 after top 8 in multiple formats, but it's unlikely to ever catch the number 1 on the list, which is even more heavily played, and that card is Chalice of the Void. Yep, the top 3 cards on this list are all artifacts that cost XX. The Chalice enters with X charge counters on it, and whenever a player casts a spell with mana value equal to the number of charge counters on it, you counter that spell. Chalice is a very important card in every format it's legal in, and if you're playing a deck with a preponderance of cards that cost 1 or 2, which is, frankly, just most decks in more powerful formats, you better have a way to deal with the Chalice or your entire game plan will get shut down. The fact it's colorless means that every single deck that wants access to the Chalice can have it too, making it one of the most heavily played cards in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. In fact, it was so oppressive in Vintage that it got restricted there in January 2015. This is because it was especially powerful in that format, where there are plenty of cards that cost 0 or 1, and it would lock way too many decks completely out of the game as early as turn 1. It simply appears in a huge percentage of decks in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and that's not going to change anytime soon, and that's why it's likely to continue to outpace Walking Ballista in the long run. Sure, the Ballista sees tons of play in multiple formats, but only in decks that can really abuse it, and not every deck is set up to do that, but every deck is set up to play Chalice of the Void, and that means it's almost impossible for it to ever lose its position as the #1 card on this list. So those are the best Magic cards with XX in the mana cost. If you like pumping lots of mana into X, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at mana costs, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.